Beginning in 1971, Idi Amin became president of a new independent Uganda, and he was president for 8 years. And during his leadership, it is estimated that 1 in 20 Ugandans perished in civil war, and a reign of terror where people who opposed him would simply disappear, their bodies often turning up in the Nile soon after their abduction by Amin's henchmen. Spies were everywhere, and it was to the church and to the religious leaders that ordinary people turned to get answers. And it was often the question of what happened to my beloved person. And it was really amazing that it was to the church. And the Anglican Church in Uganda represented about a third of the country at this time. The Church of England had just left Uganda. It was now an independent country. And so there was this change of leadership from white missionary clergy and bishops to African and local bishops and clergy taking their place. And it was both an exciting time, a sense that the people of Uganda were leading in the faith, but they were also faced with this horrible political situation to practice the gospel in. And the archbishop at the time was a man called Janani Lawum. He had been archbishop since 1974, so he was a young archbishop. And in 1977, he delivered a note to the president on behalf of his country against the policies of arbitrary killings and unexplained disappearances. And shortly afterwards, the archbishop and other leading churchmen were accused of treason. And he was having a meeting of his bishops in the convention center in Kampala. The army marched in with guns. They arrested Lawum. They took him out in front of his fellow bishops. And a couple of days later, his body was found dead in a car. And there was a staged accident. It was alleged that he was hit in a vehicle with 2 other people in the vehicle who happened to be government ministers. And witnesses also saw that these bodies were riddled with bullets, and Lawum had been shot in the mouth. And part of the story is that Amin killed him himself. That this was, and so the church was in crisis. And the next person on Amin's hit list was a young bishop called Yona Okoth. And Yona, realizing the military went to his home, searched for arms, didn't find anything, but he was next on the list, so he ran away. He had to escape. And he went to his home region that bordered Kenya, and he was able to cross a river to get to Kenya, and then came from Nairobi to Virginia, where he lived in exile for many years. And after the Amin regime was crushed, Yona goes back to Uganda and is elected the archbishop. And so he leads his people out of that trauma into the promised land, as it were. And there is a story. I worked with him in the early 90s. I'd done a lot of work in AIDS in Pasadena, and in 1991 I met him. And he said to me, "We have a problem in my country with HIV and AIDS, and can you come and help us?" And so I arranged different meetings. We would tour the United States. We would rent a car. He would often be amused that the car was always purple. The car rental was always purple. And he would preach in churches and raise money. And he was an extraordinary person. And the story in the Old Testament reading that Matt read today reminds me every sermon would begin with the story of how God saved him. And the story about the river between Uganda and Kenya, he gets to that riverbank and he can't swim. And it's a fast-flowing river. And he says a prayer and he throws himself in the river. And out of the river he comes up, and a log happens to be sailing by. And he grabs onto it, and it takes him to the other side. And it's dark, and he's wet, and there are wild beasts in the jungle. And he makes his way through that scary place, and he sees a light, and it's a house, and there's a Christian who lives in the house, and they take care of him. And he goes to Nairobi and then leaves safely. And so on. But every sermon he preached, I know that almost verbatim, how God saved him. And then he goes on to ask the question, how is God saving you? You know, and there is an aspect of that story that is quite magnificent. That here, the people of Israel, they've been traveling for 40 years. They're looking forward to the promised land. They're on the bank. They can see in the distance, but it's harvest time. The river is swollen. It's like the pictures we saw on television of these fast flowing. It's 100 feet deep now because of the waters. It's a mile wide in some places. How on earth are they going to cross that? And this becomes Joshua's first leadership challenge. Moses is dead. He has to think on his feet. And Joshua, as a military strategist, also creates a kind of public liturgy. I kind of see this. And so what he does, he instructs the priests who are carrying this wooden box, this Ark of the Covenant, carrying it on their shoulders. So imagine the scene where they're going out. They have to carry this into the waters, right? And in that box, there's a symbol that God is with them. There's the little pot of manna, the feeding in the desert. There's Moses' magical staff. There are the 10 Commandments in this little wooden box. And there are these two winged figures, the presence of God, the mercy seat on top. So imagine the morning sun. The sun is glistening on the top of the Ark of the Covenant as it's carried out into this scary place. And then there are 12 people to represent every tribe that they also have to follow. They have to go into the river with the Ark and form sentinel markers across the river to the other side. So in a way, leadership is about going into the scary place with the presence of God in the middle, and then cheering on, okay, people, let's come across. Come on, let's get over. And, you know, this area, it's known for earthquakes. It may have been there was a major earthquake. This has happened before with the Jordan. Banks come down, the river is dammed. It could have been actually a natural disaster that Joshua takes advantage of, but it's just like Yonah Akoth's story. The miracle is a log appeared, and he grabs onto it. God sent the log because God wasn't finished with him yet, and he got to the other side, and God saved him. And that's the story. The people of Israel are saved. They are facing life and death, and life was in front of them, and they, in their fear and their terror, they go ahead. And that story is really it's interesting, that's set not for the All Saints' Day readings, but it's a really appropriate reading when we contemplate the saints. And the Jordan, that lovely hymn, when I tread the verge of Jordan, bid my anxious fear subside. It is about crossing over from life through death to new life. And it's the saints of God who are the sentinels who are out in the water ahead of us, telling us to come on over. Don't worry. Hurry up. You're fine. So today I'm thinking about Yonah, who was a very holy man. That gospel reading is very powerful. It's a warning to anybody in leadership that there needs to be a kind of humility. There needs to be a way in which we are servants to one another. We are here to help the community, not to be self-serving. And it was directed towards the leaders, the bishops and the clergy of the day. The self-serving image, in some ways things have not changed. And I've certainly experienced leadership in the church that was not Christ-like, that was very self-serving. And it was people like Yonah Akoth, and getting to know him and getting to know his story and his faith and his courage how he got across that river, and then how he is Archbishop. It's interesting, in 1988, he stood up at the Lambeth Conference. All the bishops of the Anglican Union met 1988. And Jonas said, "We do not have AIDS in Africa." And all the African bishops agreed with him. 1988. And then one of his close friends, his chauffeur, many years, committed suicide when he discovered he was HIV positive. And one time he came to visit the United States, and he had this heavy burden. And the family doctor had just told him that his favorite grandson, whom he had married recently, a couple of years, that his favorite grandson, who had had a little baby girl, the little baby girl had tested HIV positive, which meant the parents, in those days, that's how a lot of people found out their children weren't thriving. And so he struggled as a father, a parent, a grandparent with, how do I tell these kids? How do I get to the other side? And it was seeing his humility and his courage. He was a very funny guy. He was tiny. When he was kind of off duty, I would see him, I'd go into his hotel room and he'd be sitting, flicking through the television channels, and he'd be giggling and laughing at American kind of, stuff on the media. And we said, "I'm just a little man from the jungle." And he'd be laughing at American culture and amused by it all. But he went back and did an amazing ministry and apologized for what he said at Lambeth, and then organized the church to respond to the crisis of AIDS. And it was probably the most important thing that he did. And so, I think about the saints, and I think about people like him who restored my faith in the church. This is what it means to be a leader in the church. I also thought about the Archbishop of my own church, George Sims. When I was a student, George Sims was the primate of the Church of Ireland, and he lived in this very grand 18th century crumbling palace, Armagh Palace, where the Archbishop, the grand old days, and he was the last Archbishop to live in that. He was also the Archbishop at the beginning of the Irish Troubles, 1969. And he would send me little notes when I was in seminary, encouraging me and sending me little book tokens. Go and buy yourself a book. Always beautifully humble and approachable and so on. And there was a moment in George Sims' ministry. He's on television, and the British government, they've just announced the decision to introduce internment without trial. This was in the context of security. The IRA, there were bombing campaigns all over Northern Ireland and in London. And so the British government makes a decision that if you're suspected as a terrorist, you're going to be pulled into jail without trial. And it was a really, really bad decision. And the next day, the lines to join the IRA were just around the corner. It was totally the wrong decision. And George Sims was live on television when the news came in, and they asked him as the Protestant leader to respond to that. And all he did was to weep. He just wept. Because he knew that we were going into a cul-de-sac, a very dark cul-de-sac. And we were going to be in that cul-de-sac for 30 years. So these holy men and women give us examples of how do we get across the river. Whether that's the river of life and death. They are sentinels. They also, it's interesting in the story, these leaders in Israel have to pick a stone from the river, right? So imagine they're carrying this round, glistening stone, and when they get to the other side, they place this stone as an altar in Gilgal. It is going to be a reminder of how God saved them. And I think about that in our own lives. Each of us, we're invited to carry a stone that we will place on the other side. It's kind of our legacy. What it is that we're passionate, what it is that God is calling us to do. And so we are surrounded by these amazing examples. And so we give thanks today. We're going to, we don't do this in church in the way we do today. We are surrounded by the light and the encouragement. Think about the people in your own life who sent you little notes and encouraged you on your journey. Come on, you can do it. And give thanks for them. And there are some who are still with us. And we're all in the same procession. So I give thanks today for this remarkable image and story of Joshua as his first kind of public leadership act. It's quite brilliant. A remarkable spectacle, a well-orchestrated strategic decision. Everyone got safely across, and they laid down their stones at Gilgal to mark this extraordinary moment in their history. Look what God has helped us to do and create. And so we rejoice in the life and the witness of those who have gone before us and still encourage us to make the crossing. Amen.
Amen.